Nancy Hanks Lincoln, the mother of future President Lincoln, died from milk sickness in Spencer County, Indiana in 1818, when young Abraham was only 9 years old. Nancy died only days after providing care to other family members who had also succumbed to the illness. The Lincoln family's experiences with milk sickness mirrored the challenges of thousands of other settlers who crossed the Appalachian Mountains seeking land and economic opportunity. Join us today for a discussion with a former KHS research fellow who will discuss the medical, environmental, and social implications of milk sickness in antebellum America, as we explore the pages of Kentucky history with Kentucky Chronicles. I'm Alan Fletcher, the host of Kentucky Chronicles, a podcast of the Kentucky Historical Society. I'm the associate editor of the Register, a scholarly journal in publication since 1903. I also coordinate our Research Fellows program. Kentucky Chronicles is a podcast that shares diverse histories from the Commonwealth and beyond. It is inspired by the works of researchers from across the world who have explored our rich archival holdings at the Kentucky Historical Society. Before we introduce today's guest, here's a quick word from Dr. Stephanie Lang, editor of the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society.
Thank you, Alan. As the holidays approach, we would like to thank all of our guests and our listeners for your support over the past 2.5 seasons of Kentucky Chronicles. From education and immigration to the Civil War and New Madrid earthquakes, the podcast has introduced new stories and events in Kentucky's history. For a festive turn, our episode today examines antebellum-era issues with milk sickness. Perhaps some food for thought as you sip your eggnog and leave cookies and milk for Santa. Happy holidays, everyone.
Thanks, Stephanie, for that visual, and your continued support of Kentucky Chronicles. Our guest today is Dr. J. Matthew Ward. He's an assistant professor of history at Quincy University in Quincy, Illinois. He holds his PhD from Louisiana State University and is the author of Garden of Ruins, Occupied Louisiana in the Civil War, published in 2024 and available from LSU Press. Additionally, he serves on the board of the Quincy and Adams County Historical Society, as well as the Lincoln Douglas Debate Museum. Today I'm happy to host Professor J. Matthew Ward, who is a recent research fellow here at the Kentucky Historical Society, and he's here today to talk with us about one of his recent research projects on milk sickness in the early Republic, the antebellum eras. And before we get too far in the weeds, what in the world is milk sickness?
Yeah, I was not familiar with it until about a year ago. I was reading Michael Burlingame's history of, or biography of Lincoln. And I guess I had just forgotten that Lincoln's mother had died of milk sickness. And so I began looking it up and trying to figure out what exactly this was. And I became increasingly intrigued with it. It's a disease that afflicted the Trans-Appalachian West, so mostly the area between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. Even though I think the earliest reports are from the 1790s in North Carolina, I've been unable to actually find those. I've always found references to them in other sources. It's a disease that is produced by cattle or hogs, either their meat or in the case of cows, their milk, that makes people very sick. Many of them even died. They would get trembles as their muscles began to degenerate. And these animals acquired the disease from a plant known as white snake root. This is what we know now due to decades of research, especially in the early 20th century. But during the 19th century, there were all sorts of theories about what caused this disease and how to treat it, and none of them were very successful. So it ends up being this really scary medical mystery for much of the antebellum period and even after.
And I think there's an important Kentucky connection here that can be explored too, because a lot of listeners might be familiar with Transylvania College, which is in Lexington, had a very well-respected medical college during the 19th century. So how are medical professionals thinking about milk sickness during this time?
The earliest account, or the earliest reference, I should say, is to a doctor named Thomas Barbee. Some sources say he's from Virginia, and I've even found his marriage records in Virginia. Others say that he's from Bourbon County, Kentucky. I think he probably moved there over time. He observed the the ravages of milk sickness in lower Ohio in the early 1800s, 1810s. And he tells Daniel Drake about it. Daniel Drake, the Benjamin Franklin of the West, probably the most famous doctor in the Western territories of the United States in the antebellum era. So you've got Barbie, you've got Drake, you've got others like William Woody Hall. They've all got their own little spins on what's causing this disease. Generally, medical professionals focused on some sort of miasma or weird exhalation, as they might call it, that was coming out of the earth. David Dale Owen, who was the state geologist of Kentucky for a while, he sees a geological problem here. He thinks that there are certain toxins that are in the soil that are leaching into the roots. And a lot of medical professionals kind of follow along with this. Certainly Daniel Drake is a fan of this theory. So there's some sort of poisonous substance like arsenic or some sort of oxide. It's leaching into the soil, and then it's leaching up into the roots of plant systems, and then the cows or the pigs or the horses are eating this and they're getting sick. They're half right? And because it is a plant that's causing the sickness, but they're wrong about the source by which that plant is producing toxin. White snake root contains a poison called trematol, and that's what produces all the symptoms like ataxia and loss of muscle control. But for many, many years in the 19th century, people thought it was some sort of toxin in the soil that was affecting the plants, and then that was affecting the cattle.
So you've got all these medical professionals that are trying to make sense of this sickness. So let's think about the flip side too. How are your ordinary, average, everyday settlers encountering milk sickness? Of course, they're encountering it, but how are they thinking about it? Are their ideas about how to deal with it any different? What's the lived reality for a lot of people?
Unfortunately, a lot of settlers move into the Trans-Appalachian West. And I should note, this disease affects Kentucky, Ohio, and Indiana the worst, really along the Ohio River.
Is that because of environmental conditions?
Yes. White snake root grows really well in shaded areas, in mesic forests. So forests that are a little bit damp and shaded. It can grow in the sun, just not quite as large, and it's not quite as potent. But along riverways like the Ohio River, the Kentucky River, the Mad River in Ohio, these are all places that became central sites of sickness outbreaks in the 19th century. And so settlers are moving into these regions, and they don't necessarily worry about fencing in their cattle or their pigs or their hogs right away. If you move into what to them was a wilderness area, they're more concerned about getting their crops in the ground, about clearing land, about getting a shelter for their family. So there's not exactly a lot of farming structures early on in the 19th century. And it was quite common all the way back to the Puritans in New England to just sort of let your farm animals wander around in the woods. You might mark them or brand them in some way so you could find them later. And it's not necessarily a bad technique. It saves money because the animals sort of feed themselves, and it saves time because you don't have to build structures for them. But on the other hand, it exposes these animals, of course, to plants like white snake root that produce a lot of problems. To get back to your original question, in my opinion, a lot of the farmers and settlers seem to be a bit smarter about this than the scientists are, because people like Daniel Drake are really concerned about, some sort of toxin in the soil. David Dale Owen's looking at various soil reports, and they're getting very scientific about it. The farmers are like, what if I just fence in my cattle, feed them only hay and see if they get sick, or feed them only this? There's a farmer in Ohio whose name I'm blanking on at the moment, later on in like the 1830s, who narrowed the problem down to white snake root. He just sort of had several animals, fed them each different plants, and all the ones that ate white snake root developed trembles. None of the scientists really seem to listen to these folks very much. I know that Daniel Drake took to the pages of his Western Journal of Medicine and said, well, this is just a farmer. He's not done any real scientific research. who knows what he fed these cows? We have to reproduce his experiment and all this sort of dismiss this. I'll give credit to David Owen. He did perform an autopsy on a cow in, I want to say 1839, but that's not really an effective way to figure out what was causing those problems. You could see the problems inside, like the problems of muscle deterioration and that sort of thing, but it did not help him figure out that it was white snake root. So for the most part, farmers, settlers, they're just figuring it out as they go. And over time, their environmental strategies kind of help them solve this problem on accident, right? Because they clear the forests, and that makes a lot of the vegetation that is sheltered by those forests die out, including white snake root. The more time they spend in places like Kentucky or Ohio or Indiana, the more structures they build, including barns and pens. They get their animals in there, and they're not roaming around as much. So that really cuts down on milk sickness as well. You mentioned Transylvania earlier. So I'm going to chase a tangent right quick. Transylvania has several, like 10 or 11 medical theses that medical students did as their final project, I guess you would say, that they presented in defense of their medical degree. The first one is from 1827. And in the late 1820s and throughout the 1830s, when most of them are presented, there's 3 in the 1840s. So you see this surge of medical knowledge, of experimentation from people at the local level in the 1820s and 30s as the population levels in the West go up, as death rates from various diseases increase. People are looking for ways to mitigate this. So I see the 1820s and 30s as this big moment of experimentation, both from the medical community and from these kind of local farmers and things that you asked about.
Interesting. We've got sort of a Transylvania theme developing with this season of the podcast too. We have James Cousins, who talked about Horace Hawley and his time at Transylvania. I'm partial because that's where I did my undergraduate work.
It's a good school.
It is. Go Pioneers. You used the phrase environmental strategy, and that's something that I find really fascinating about your larger project in general, is that this is not just a history of milk sickness or health, but you seem to be using milk sickness as a way of thinking very broadly about environment, about agriculture. And you alluded to this a little bit in some of your previous answers, but what are some of the larger environmental and agricultural implications of milk sickness in Trans-Appalachia?
First of all, it demonstrates settlers' worst fears about the environment, that the environment dominates them, right, and not the other way around. In the 19th century, that's largely dominated by patriarchal households and agricultural subsistence. Having control over the land is paramount to survival, right? You need to be able to grow enough food to sustain your family. And then if you've got a surplus, you can begin to trade on the rivers, as many people were beginning to do along the Mississippi and the Ohio. But what a lot of settlers discover as they move into these Western areas is that the wilderness, bites back, so to speak, against the swing of the axe and the bite of the plow. And there are numerous reports, the earliest from the traveler Thomas Ashe, which, he can't always be trusted. He's got some value judgments buried away in his travel narrative that was published in 1808. But he talks about the town of New Lancaster in Ohio that had been this booming town. And then within 2 years, there's some sort of disease and he doesn't know that kills 2/3 of the inhabitants. And then it's stopped by the frost. So that fits right in with milk sickness. So that's the first environmental influence I would talk about, is just the fact that milk sickness, along with dangerous animals, flooding, heavy snow, the Trans-Appalachian West presents a very serious environmental obstacle to the dreams of dominance and development that many settlers bring with them. Secondly, we need to consider the environment in terms of looking at milk sickness, because there's a very specific seasonal cycle to how it develops. The plant begins blooming in the spring. It's usually at its full height or full development in the summer. And that's also the hottest months of the year. So animals like cattle are going to be seeking out the shade more often. They're going to be looking for green vegetation over, say, dry brown grass or things like that. So they're more likely to eat white snake root in the summer. It takes a while for them, depends on how much they eat, how quickly. But once they've eaten a certain percentage of their body weight in white snake root, they begin to produce poisonous meat or milk. And so that's why most of the outbreaks that people experience in Kentucky and Ohio and Indiana, and to some extent Illinois, happen in the fall. For instance, Abraham Lincoln's mother most famously dies of milk sickness in October. So there's a environmental cycle that's occurring here with these plants. And then lastly, as I already mentioned, if the Trans-Appalachian West presents an environmental obstacle to these folks, they eventually overcome that obstacle with their own environmental strategies, which is clear the land, cut down the trees, fence in the cattle, don't let them wander around anymore. And as they clear more of the land, destroy more of the white snake root inadvertently, and fence in more of their animals, that's an environmental solution to an environmental problem, even though that solution is also laced with a certain level of destruction to the land.
As you mentioned earlier, we often don't give settlers enough credit for the problem solving that they had to do under these circumstances. And while we're on the topic of talking about people, I'd also be interested in hearing about some of the social implications of this too. The research talk that you gave here at KHS had a very great title, A Poor Cow at the Door. Which I think really gets at some of the social and class dynamics of this as well. So could you speak to that?
I love that quote. I took that quote from William Whitty Hall, who published a medical journal in the antebellum era. And in 1855, I've got the quote pulled up here. He publishes his theory about what causes milk sickness. And again, getting back to this idea that there's something in the soil or the dirt that is making these plants poisonous. He says that the cows eat too much withered plants, and that pulls up a lot of dirt when they're pulling up that plant, and then they consume the dirt, and it's the dirt that's making them sick. And then he, because of that theory, says if you either have really healthy land that doesn't have these kind of desiccated plants that are going to come up with a lot of dirt, your cows won't get sick. Or if you feed them by hand, if you put them up in the barn in a stall and you feed them hay and really good grass, then they won't get sick. So there's this class connotation to who is getting sick with milk sickness. It's the really poor farmers. It's the ones that live deepest in the woods or along unsettled parts of the frontier. And that makes sense because those poorer farmers are going to find the cheapest land or the land that is unclaimed. And it also makes sense environmentally because those are the regions of the Trans-Appalachian West that are going to be most rife with this plant, white snake root. So there is a class connection there. I don't think that the character judgment that he's making, that these poor folks don't know how to take care of their animals and they're dirty and their land is not well cultivated, as he said. But he has this great quote, nevertheless, at the end of his medical article. And he says, "Feed your cows well, and you will never be troubled with milk sickness. And when traveling in newly settled parts of the Western country, or even through old settlements, never stop at a house where you see a poor cow at the door." So he's kind of judging the quality of the settlers based on the quality of their land and the quality of their animals. This is not something new. This is not something that Hall invented. People have been doing this for decades, not even in America. For instance, a lot of justifications in the early Indian or African slave trade, or when Europeans show up and they're like, these folks, they wear hardly anything. They believe in these pagan gods, and they don't have nice fences all around their land, and they're savages. So the quality of their civilization is not as good. Of course, we can enslave them. So this kind of character judgment that's going on based on the way that cultures practice their agriculture or their land management is pretty frequent This is a problem for folks who are trying to settle the Trans-Appalachian West because they're mostly white people. They don't want to be associated with savages, even though that association gets made in a number of travel journals. It gets made in even some more modern historiography. Thomas Clark even says, like, the early settlers were basically uneducated folks living out in the wilderness, and then they gradually built themselves up. So even modern day historians sometimes take this idea and run with it. There's a great quote from the history of Du Bois County in Indiana, which was published in 1910, in which the author says that people are always blaming the folks in the next town. Like, oh, we don't have any milk sickness here. It's at the Irish settlement down the road. And you would go there and they would say, oh, absolutely not. It's in the next town down the road. In the past few weeks, I've been reading lots of Kentucky newspapers. And I've been really surprised to find that even though outbreaks of milk sickness get more and more rare the closer you get to the 20th century, it's still around. So during presidential elections like 1896 or 1900, there were people who were saying, we don't find any support for the Democrats around, such and such town or such and such county. It's just like milk sickness. It's always in the next county over. So that social judgment of like, we don't have milk sickness, it's those people over there, stuck around for a long time in the 19th and 20th century.
I can only imagine the political campaigns and political advertisements over milk sickness.
I even found a reference to, there was like a coal strike somewhere in Kentucky. I'd have to pull up the newspaper again. And there was an anti-union paper that was publishing an article that said, it'd be easier to find the solution to milk sickness than to find any of our miners who are pro-union. And this was in like the 1880s or something. So this idea is still sticking around, that it's this really negative thing that's associated with poorer people who don't take care of themselves or their land. And it's sort of infiltrated political dialogue in the late 19th century.
And you mentioned that the incidence of milk sickness is decreasing as we get further into the 19th century. At what point do we get a better handle on understanding milk sickness, and when does it disappear more or less? Does it disappear?
It has disappeared as of today. I guess technically, since white snake root still exists, an animal could eat it, and ostensibly a human could consume the milk or meat of that animal and then die. But I think everybody pretty much knows not to do that. The absolute solution to milk sickness comes in the 1910s or 1920s. I'm blanking on the name of the doctor. It was a study sponsored by the Department of Agriculture. So you get a lot of people in the early 20th century, like Edward Jordan and Norman Harris. They come up with this idea that it's Bacillus lactomorbi, this bacteria that's on the plant. So it's not the plant itself. And so the Department of Agriculture conducts these experiments where they sterilize white snake root and they feed it to animals, and they still develop trembles. So that proved that it wasn't a bacterial infection. And so people keep conducting experiments, and it's James Couch, that's his name, in 1928, who is the first to isolate trematol in the plant and figure out that that is absolutely the cause of it. Until that moment, I think we see a drastic decrease in the number of infections and outbreaks in the latter 19th century for the exact reasons I've mentioned before. Most of the land has been cleared and settled, so a lot of white snake root has been wiped out inadvertently, and people are housing their animals.
I always am interested in talking about sources and methodologies, and you've touched on this a little bit. You mentioned that you've consulted travel journals, you've looked at medical journals, the writings of medical professionals, but it strikes me that when researching an illness like milk sickness that had so many unknowns, especially in the early 19th century, that finding sources would be really difficult to get at this topic. So could you talk a little bit about some of those challenges and ways that you've gotten around some of those challenges?
Most of the sources come from medical journals, which does bias that information a little bit because a lot of scientists at this time, as we've talked about previously, are pretty biased towards their own opinions rather than, whatever these farmers are doing out there. I have come across some letters or diaries at KHS or the Filson Institute that help me give more of a ground level view of that. In fact, there's a great diary from a school teacher, very lengthy one, named Addison Ballard at KHS. I mean, it's like 700 pages, all handwritten. And within the first few pages of that diary, he says, a lot of my friends want to move off to the Wabash country in Indiana, but they're all terrified of milk sickness, so they won't go. So there are references that just sort of pepper the historical record, and it's a matter of time, just sitting and sifting through a lot of letters and diaries and farm records, hoping to find something, because it's pretty easy to go through travel journals and medical journals and find things, newspapers as well. And I'm not going to discount those sources and those perspectives, but finding ground level perspectives from people who had milk sickness it's very difficult. I've been able to find a few, and hopefully I can find some more, but those moments are very brief and far in between the much more populous medical records.
I don't imagine there's too many milk sickness collections or folders with the milk sickness label floating around. It really is like a treasure hunt, I would imagine.
Part of the problem is I don't think that milk sickness was very easily identified, especially in the early part of the 19th century. Milk sickness looks a lot like cholera. It looks a lot like various other diseases, smallpox, scarlet fever, yellow fever. A lot of these diseases present with fever and vomiting, and, if you have it long enough, some sort of coma. And people could vomit blood. Once you read enough of these disease experiences, whether it be with cholera or milk sickness, it really reminds me of the short story, The Mask of the Red Death, by Edgar Allan Poe, which was published in 1842. So it's more than enough time for him to have witnessed these kinds of terrible disease outbreaks in antebellum America. So there may have been plenty of folks who experienced milk sickness, but they don't necessarily know what to call it or how to write about it. So that makes it even harder to find. I came across numerous letters at KHS and at the Filson where people are describing some sort of what they call bilious fever that presents with vomiting and various other symptoms that correlate to milk sickness. And we'll never know for sure, but it does indicate that sickness is a huge problem for 19th century America, especially cholera. But if someone is writing from a more frontier area as opposed to a city where cholera is going to be more prevalent because of the close contact and all the dirty water, I'm more likely to look at some feverish disease they're describing as milk sickness.
Well, what is the long-term plan for this project? Do you imagine it as a book, as an article, or where do you see yourself going with this?
I would like to write 2 articles. I'm almost done with one. Something for the Kentucky Register that's very Kentucky specific, because I'm particularly interested in, even though disease is worse for Ohio and Indiana, Kentucky often comes into contact with milk sickness because of its association with its Midwestern neighbors. For instance, there is an account that I came across. Let's see if I can get it pulled up here. In 1868, this is the Louisville Daily Democrat. And so this is post-bellum. This is after the Civil War. About 40 people in Owensboro, Kentucky, that are staying at the Planters Hotel and the National Hotel. I don't know why they were all having a big dinner together, but they're all having a big dinner. And then they all get sick at once and start vomiting everywhere right after they drink the milk. And it turns out, the newspaper does an investigation. It turns out that even though this is a city in Kentucky, both of the hotels are using a dairyman from Indiana. And so they bring in this milk that's tainted with milk sickness. They don't realize it. All of their people get sick. So Kentucky kind of is guilty by association with a lot of milk sickness. And so using Kentucky as the site of studying milk sickness allows me to explore those environmental factors that I've already talked about, but also those social factors. People in Kentucky can always point towards Indiana and say, oh, it's those folks that brought milk sickness over to us. And in some cases, they were correct about that. Kentucky's a great historical venue for looking at both of those angles. So that's one part of the project I'm working on is Kentucky as site of milk sickness. And what does that say about medical history, environmental history, and social history? And then I would like to write just a broader article as well about milk sickness in general, because it does affect Ohio and Indiana so much. It does affect Illinois a bit. There's the relatively popular myth in Illinois about Anna Pierce Hobbs Bixby. She supposedly solved milk sickness in the late 1830s. There's already an extensive podcast episode about her from the Stuff You Missed in History class folks, and they do a really good job of demonstrating that that even though she was a real person, more than likely she did not solve milk sickness. So there are larger issues at play with milk sickness that are not Kentucky specific. So I would like to write another article that kind of is able to address all the things that I can't put into a Kentucky-centric article.
Well, we look forward to any writings or articles that come out of this project. And with that, I think that's a good place to wrap things up. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Although milk sickness is now an afterthought, its legacy cast a long shadow over 19th century America. As Professor Ward noted, milk sickness posed challenges far beyond health and wellness. It forced white settlers to rethink their agricultural and environmental strategies as they adapted to the unforgiving wilderness of the Trans-Appalachian West. The story of milk sickness in early America offers a timely reminder that humans can rarely force their will on the environment. Rather, we are often at the mercy of Mother Nature. Kentucky Chronicles is presented by the Kentucky Historical Society, with support from the Kentucky Historical Society Foundation. Our show is produced by Gregory Hardison, with support from Dr. Stephanie Lang. Our theme music is used courtesy of Pixabay. To learn more about our publication of the Register or our Research Fellows program, please visit our website, history.ky.gov. If you have enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe. You can also help us build a following by telling your friends and colleagues. Thanks again to Professor Ward for appearing on today's episode, and I look forward to welcoming our next guest on Kentucky Chronicles.